Good evening. Welcome to Ron's Ramblings. This is number 18 in our series. It's part 9 in the life of Noah. As the last session ended, we were talking about the sons of Noah. And the verse that we were looking at was Genesis chapter 5 and verse 32. One of the last things I said in regard to this verse was that Noah's sons were not triplets, and they were not all born when Noah was 500 years old. I also said that the order, as it's listed in this verse, is not in chronological order. I believe the scriptures, being the Word of God, are error-free. So this particular arrangement of Noah's sons is not about age. I can say that with confidence because of a couple of scriptures. The first of those scriptures is Genesis 9 and verse 24. That verse shows us that Noah is referring to Ham and calls him his younger son. The Hebrew word that is translated younger or rendered younger in our Bibles is the word katom, which carries three very similar meanings. When speaking in regard to size, it means diminutive. When speaking in regard to quantity, it means least. And when speaking in regard to age, it can mean either youngest or younger. So here in Genesis 9:24, and we'll see this better after the flood when we talk about the details of Noah's life. When Noah is referring to his younger son, the comparison is between Ham and the other two. In effect, Noah is saying that Ham is the younger of the other two. Obviously, the other two are Shem and Japheth. Therefore, Ham is the youngest of the three. And the second verse that is applicable to the age of Noah's sons is Genesis chapter 10 and verse 21. There it is said, unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder, even to him were children born. And the comparison there, when the reference is made to Japheth the elder, is between Shem and Japheth. And it is the Hebrew word gadol, which simply means the older of the two. So the result of the first reference was Ham is younger than the other two. And the result of this reference is Japheth is older than Shem. The conclusion then can only be that Noah's sons, if we arrange them in age order, would be Japheth, who is the oldest, then Shem, and then finally Ham. You may already recognize that this verse is part of the genealogical record of Noah's three sons and the nations that they fathered. There's also no record of Noah having any other children, either before the flood or after the flood. Personally, I believe that Noah's wife was barren during the first years of their marriage. But when the time was right, God opened her womb, just as he did Sarah's womb, Sarah being the wife of Abraham, when the time was right. So when Noah was 500 years old, the time must have been right, and Japheth was born. I also believe Noah had only 3 children, the ones we've just identified. There are, however, those who believe that Noah had another son that isn't mentioned in the Bible. That son's name is purported to be Canaan. According to Islam, Canaan, which means son of Noah, was the 4th son of Noah, and his wife's name was Naamah. We don't find either of those names. We do find Canaan's name in there, but not in relationship to being a fourth son. It's one of Ham's descendants. We don't find the word Nama listed anywhere that I can find. Uh, I, the the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, are very, very critical, and because of the canon, they they have been looked at many, many times. I think if there was a fourth son of Noah, it would be there if God had inspired it to be. Since it isn't there, then I don't think Noah had but 3 sons. I think they were Japheth, Shem, and Ham. Now, as I said, there is a descendant of Noah through Ham whose name is Canaan. And according to Genesis chapter 10, verse 6, Ham had 4 sons. One was named Cush, one was named Mizraim, one was named Phut, and one was named Canaan. And by the way, the nation that is descended through Canaan, Ham's son, are familiar to all of us if we are even closely intimate with the scriptures, because the names that are there are the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, and several other ites. And by the way, a couple of the cities that are listed within the borders of the lands that Canaan, the descendant of Ham, occupied were Sodom and Gomorrah. But that's getting pretty far afield. Let's get ourselves back on track. I don't believe Noah had but 3 sons. And I think that the entire population of the world stems from those 3 sons. Genesis chapter 10 is the record by son and by nation. And it is in that record that we find the names that we've just talked about. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and on and on. And they are descendants of Ham. So, as mentioned in Genesis chapter 11, verse 10, it says, "These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood." From the 2 statements in this verse, we get a very important date, and that is that Shem was 100 years old 2 years after the flood. Now stay with me. There's going to be some numbers that we're going to have to deal with, but they're important to us. Shem was 100 years old 2 years after the flood. Keep that in mind because we're going to need it in a few minutes. What I'm about to show you now, from these 3 verses that we've just looked at, and a couple of more, is a clear picture of the actual time of the flood, how long the water was on the earth, and exactly when the land was dry. And then, after that, we'll do a little arithmetic, and we'll be able to tell about when God told Noah to build the ark, and we'll have a much clearer idea of the time frame in regard to Noah and the building of the ark. And we might even take another peek at that 120 years that we've talked about already. So, when did the flood begin? Well, the scriptures provide that to us. They provide the exact day that the flood began. It is the day that it began to rain on the earth, possibly for the very first time. It's also the day that the fountains of the deep were broken up. Those 2 things occurred on the same day, and that day was the 17th day of the 2nd month in the 600th year of Noah's life. That comes from Genesis chapter 7 and verse 11. As I mentioned earlier, since the very beginning, God has been keeping track of the passage of time. The fact that there are no gaps in that tells me that God intended for us to know those lifespans. And he intended for us to know the interrelated events that are in the record and when those things happened. In this very early period, the period of the patriarchs, God kept that time relative to the age of whichever patriarch was alive at that specific time. The one we're discussing now, of course, is Noah. So everything in the record is in regard to Noah's life. So when we say that the rain began to fall and the fountains of the deep opened up, it was on the 17th day of the second month in Noah's 600th year of life. Unfortunately, some don't view the biblical record as being accurate in regard to time. Certainly, the time some things happened are not as important as the event themselves. But in certain areas, such as the one we're looking at, the time does matter. And in those areas, God just gave us good clues as to what those times were. Matter of fact, in the later periods, there's even events that occur both in secular history as well as biblical history. And when that occurs, we're able to cross-relate those events so that we can put secular time or attach secular time to biblical time. What allows us to do that is the genealogies that are provided for us in the scriptures. Without them, we would not be able to trace anything as far as time is concerned. But God provided them. Those genealogies are there, and they tie the men together and supply the links that we need to keep an accurate record of the time for that particular period and others as well. So when we see the flood began in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, that's when it happened. And the flood ended in like manner. The scripture provides the exact day that happened. God determined when the ground was dry. And when it was dry enough for him to empty the ark, that happened to be on the 27th day of the second month in the 601st year of Noah's life. That comes from Genesis chapter 8 and verse 14. However, we need to do a couple of things with this verse, because it's the one just before it in verse 13 that provides the whole picture, because it gives the year of Noah's life. So I'm going to do that by putting both verses together on the screen behind me. Verse 13 of Genesis chapter 8 might appear, the part that I have in yellow, might appear to contradict what verse 14 says, but in fact it does not. We'll talk about this more in detail when we talk about what goes on during the flood. But for right now, it's enough to say that verse 13 that we're looking at here, the top half of the screen, was the viewpoint from Noah. By the time Noah thought the earth was dry, the ark had been setting on the mountains of Ararat for weeks. Noah had opened the window after a certain period of time, and he had sent out a raven and a dove. And then later, when the raven doesn't come back, but the dove does, he sends out a second dove. Maybe the same dove goes out again. But at that time, he looks out of that window that is in the ark for him to do that. and he sees the mountaintops. And maybe even he sees further down the mountains and believes the land was dry. And that happened in the first day of the first month, as you can see in the top part of this chart. In the first day of the first month in the 601st year of his life. But Noah couldn't see down in the valleys. He couldn't see what was on the other side of the mountain. And so they didn't get to come out of the ark on that first month, first day of the first month in the 601st year. But almost 2 months later, on the 27th day of the second month, in the same year as verse 13, that would be the 601st year of Noah's life, God pronounced the land dry, and they could leave the ark. That officially ended the flood in God's eyes. And they left the ark that very same day, the 27th day of the second month in Noah's 601st year. Now, as you can see from this slide, from the first day that the rain began to fall, the rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights, you remember, and the fountains of the deep were broken up. Those things both occurred on the 17th day of the second month in Noah's 600th year, as we saw before. And then the time from that point until the land was dry, which was in the 601st year of Noah's life, on the 27th day of the second month, you can find that the water was on the earth for 1 year and 10 days. That's not how long they were in the ark. They had gone into the ark a week early before the rain started. We'll talk about that later. But the water was on the earth for 1 year and 10 days. Now, putting these dates together and remembering what we saw in regard to Noah's 3 sons, because when we combine those two and apply the dates between them to each other, it provides us with 6 beneficial facts. First, Ham is the youngest of Noah's 3 sons. That was provided us by Genesis chapter 9 and verse 24. This is going to help us to determine when God told Noah to build the ark. Second, Japheth is the oldest of the 3 sons. We saw that in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 21. This is not a particularly critical fact, but it is helpful, as we'll see later. In all likelihood, Japheth was born when Noah was 500 years old. And third, and this is critical, Shem was 100 years old 2 years after the flood. Again, that is found in Genesis chapter 11 and verse 10, and it's one of those things I told you a while ago not to forget, because it's going to be important, and it's still going to be important in helping us determine when Noah was told about the destruction of the world and the building of the ark. Fourth, the beginning of the flood, we've already seen, was marked as being on the 17th day of the second month in the 600th year of Noah's life. That comes from Genesis chapter 7 and verse 11, as we just looked at a while ago. Fifth, the ending day of the flood was on the 27th day of the second month in the 601st year of Noah's life. That's from Genesis 8:13 and 14, actually, just as we saw a few minutes ago. When we subtract the end date from the beginning date, we saw that the flood was on the earth, or the water was on the earth, for 1 year and 10 days. Now, let's put these things all together and see what comes out. From these facts, we can conclude with complete confidence that in the 603rd year of Noah's life, we saw the flood ended in the 601st year of Noah's life. So 2 years after the flood, when Shem had his first son, our facts said, 2 years after the flood, Noah would be 603. The flood ended in 601. 2 years after the flood would be his 603rd year. And it is in this year, the 603rd year, that Shem was said to be 100 years old, which means Shem was born when Noah was 503 years old. Therefore, in Genesis 5:32, where it is said, and Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the son that was born in Noah's 500th year was not Shem. And we also remember Ham was even younger. So the only one he could be, if there was in fact a son born in Noah's 500th year, it had to be Japheth. But let's look a little further. If we go forward from there, Genesis chapter 6, verses 17 and 18, we find that God told Noah he was going to destroy the world and all flesh wherein is the breath of life. Everything is going to die. But God tells Noah that Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives would go into the ark. This appears to be very close to the same time that God said he was going to reduce man's days to 120 years. And if that is correct, then it isn't possible for the 120 years to be a countdown to the flood. Nor is it possible for the 120 years to be a period of grace or a waiting period, if you will, for repentance of the wicked. Because when God told Noah that he and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives would go into the ark, we are at most 75 or 80 years from those first raindrops. Now, let's look and see how we know that. We know without question when the flood began. The 17th day of the 2nd month in Noah's 600th year. We deduced that Japheth was the son born in Noah's 500th year, if in fact one was, but that's not too critical. We do know, though, that Shem was born in the 503rd year of Noah's life, as we just saw a few minutes ago. And we also know that the earliest possible time that Ham could have been born is late in year 503 of Noah's life, or 504, or 505 at some point later. He could not have been born between Shem and Japheth because he is younger than they. And if Japheth was the one born in the 500th year of Noah's life, and if Shem was born, as we say, if Japheth was the one born in 500, and if Shem was born in the 503rd year of Noah's life, there is no way Ham could have been born before late in year 503 or in 504 without some kind of a miraculous intervention. And there's no mention of that, and I don't believe that happened. And then, one thing more, we know for a certainty that God told Noah that he and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives were going to go into the ark. That tells us that all 3 sons were married. God also said that they are married. All 3 sons are married. I don't know when any of them got married. I don't know the ages that they were. But we can find out some things. I know I was pretty young when I got married. Joanne and I married when I was 18 and she was 17. Very few people believed we'd still be married after 5 years. The fact of the matter, some of them just came out and said it won't last 2 years. They're just too young to be married. Why are they saying things like that? Well, the reason is because, believe it or not, marrying before you were 20 years old was just not done very much in 1959. Let me show you a chart. This is according to the United States Census of marriages, first marriages. And the chart goes all the way back to 1890, but I just showed the last period of time from 1950 to 2010. Look at the average ages there that males and females marry. The youngest one I see is 22.8 for males and 20.3 for females. And like I said, I was 18 and Joanne was 17. Well, back in the 1890s, that when this record was first started, the average age for males was 26. And the further back you go, just from what people have said, it may be even older than that. Certainly, it probably was in Noah's time, because most commentators take the position that the typical time for a son to marry would be when he was 30 to 40 years old. I don't want to use 30 to 40. We can, and we'll come up with some figures based on that. But I always like to be conservative every chance that I get. So instead of using 30 to 40 years as the time that Ham, or whichever was the latest one to get married, let's use 20 to 30 as the range for when they married. And I'm going to assume it was Ham since he was the youngest. We said that he was probably born when Noah was 504 years old. So if we add 20 or 30 years to that for Ham to grow up and to marry, it would be when Noah was in his 524th or 534th or anywhere in between. So doing the math then and subtracting Noah's age when Ham married, if it was Ham that was the youngest, the one that married the latest, would mean that if God told Noah about the destruction of the world and the building of the ark, so that they, on that very day that they married, that only leaves us 66 to 76 years before the rain starts falling. And even if we say that Ham married earlier, let's just say he married when he was 16 years old, which probably is not so, but let's just say maybe he was. That only gives us 79 years before the first rain falls. And that's the maximum time, by the way, for Noah to build the ark. But if Ham was 40, like the commentators say, Noah would only have 55 years to build the ark. And that 120 years that we talked about that some people say is a countdown to the flood, how can that be if it was said 55 years before the flood? Well, the bottom line is very simple, and it's this. None of those scenarios allow for more than 79 years for the building of the ark, nor do any of them provide for the 120 years, which leaves us with the only other alternative. The 120 years was God placing a limit on man's lifespan, like we said at the beginning, rather than a warning or a countdown to the flood. And Noah has somewhere between a minimum of 55 years to a maximum of 79 years to build the ark. So he wasn't building the ark for 100 years and preaching, as some say. Well, our time has run out, so we'll just pick up here, talk a little bit about the flood next time, and try to end this up as quickly as we can. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a good evening and good night.